The date is January 11th, 1944. The time is just past noon. At 29,000 feet, high above the freezing clouds over Oschersleben, Germany, Lieutenant Alistair Finch is fighting for his life. His aircraft, a B-17G Flying Fortress, is being torn apart by cannon fire from a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. Suddenly, a 20mm explosive shell rips through the nose, shattering the cockpit and instantly killing his pilot. Finch is now alone, exposed to the impossible 60 below zero wind blast. His instruments are destroyed, his oxygen lines are severed, and hundreds of miles of hostile territory lie between him and home. All he has to guide the crippled four-engine bomber is a simple paper star chart, a flimsy piece of paper against a vast, indifferent sky. He was a navigator, not a pilot, but now he had to be both. Lieutenant Finch's desperate flight was not an isolated incident. It was a single, harrowing moment in a colossal, failing strategy. By early 1944, the American 8th Air Force was engaged in a brutal war of attrition, flying unescorted, deep-penetration daylight bombing raids into the heart of Germany. The official doctrine, championed by generals who believed the heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortress was invincible, was that the bomber will always get through. The mission on January 11th was a prime example of this hubris. The target was a vital Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Oschersleben, a facility so critical that the Luftwaffe would throw everything it had to defend it. The German defense was orchestrated by a master of aerial combat, General of Fighters Adolf Galland. Galland understood that he couldn't stop every bomber. His strategy wasn't to win every battle, but to make the cost of each raid so astronomically high that the Americans would be forced to abandon their campaign. He armed his pilots with new, devastating weapons. The FW-190s attacking Finch's group weren't just carrying machine guns. They were equipped with 20mm and 30mm cannons firing explosive shells designed to rip a bomber's wing off with a single hit. They pioneered brutal head-on attack tactics, flying straight at the bomber formations, guns blazing, to terrorize the pilots and bypass the B-17's heaviest defensive firepower, which faced a rear. This aggressive strategy was working because the American doctrine had a fatal flaw: range. The little friends, the P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, simply didn't have the fuel to accompany the bombers all the way to targets like Oschersleben and back. They were forced to turn around at the German border, leaving the bomber formations naked and vulnerable for the most dangerous part of their journey. The sky over Germany became a slaughterhouse. Bomber crews were expected to complete a 25-mission tour to go home, but the math was grim. The 8th Air Force was losing over 5% of its planes on every deep raid. The odds of survival were terrifyingly low. This created a palpable sense of hopelessness among the crews. They were flying in sub-zero temperatures, breathing from oxygen masks for 8 to 10 hours at a time, knowing that their best defense, the tight combat box formation, could be shattered in an instant. They watched friends in neighboring planes vanish in a fireball, their parachutes failing to open. They knew that official tactics were sending them to their deaths. It was in this crucible of strategic failure and immense human cost that Alistair Finch found himself alone at 30,000 feet, with his plane in pieces and his pilots dead. The system had failed him. Now, survival was entirely up to him. Before the war, Alistair Finch was not a man of action or a daredevil pilot. He was a quiet, meticulous student at the University of Cambridge, his head not in the clouds of combat, but in the nebulae of deep space. His passion was astronomy. He spent his nights charting the slow, elegant dance of star clusters, and his days studying the physics of celestial bodies. When war broke out, the Royal Air Force looked at his unique skill set and saw him not a pilot, but a navigator. He was trained to guide a bomber to its target using sextants, charts, and precise calculations, a complex job, but one performed from the relative safety of a navigator's table, inside the plane with a pilot at the controls. The aha moment for Finch wasn't a flash of mechanical genius in a quiet hangar. It was a spark of desperate hope in the middle of a sub-zero hurricane. After the initial shock of the explosion, as he fought against the deafening roar and the oxygen-starved haze, he had a fleeting moment of pure clarity. Every complex instrument that told him his speed, his altitude, his direction, all of it was gone, reduced to shattered glass and twisted metal. But as he looked past the jagged hole where his windshield used to be, he saw one instrument that the Germans couldn't destroy: the sun. He knew the date. He knew the approximate time. He knew his rough location over Germany. And in his frozen flight bag, tucked away for the return journey, was his primary tool: a Mercator projection star chart. In Navigator school, they practiced celestial navigation as a backup, a what-if scenario. But that training assumed a functioning aircraft, a clear view through the Astrodome, and most importantly, a qualified pilot flying the plane. What Finch was about to do was never taught. It was considered impossible. His act of innovation was a crime against all protocol and reason. Ignoring every regulation, he unclipped himself from his ruined station, the wind tearing at him. He crawled over the lifeless body of his co-pilot, Captain Miller, a man he'd shared coffee with just hours before, and strapped himself into the pilot's seat. He was a navigator. He had never flown AB-17. He had only watched, observing the pilots, never touching controls in flight. Now he gripped the yoke, his hands freezing, and began the terrifying process of flying the 30-ton bomber by sheer feel. His clandestine act was this usurpation. To the 10 other men in the back of the bomber, who were likely still fending off attackers, they only knew their plane was flying erratically. They had no idea that their cockpit was open to the sky, and their survival now rested on a 22-year-old academic with a paper map of the stars. With his hands threatening to freeze solid to controls, Alistair Finch's first challenge was simply to keep the B-17 from falling out of the sky. The bomber, trimmed for stable flight with 2 pilots, was now a wild beast, its nose trying to lurch downwards, its wings wanted to roll over. He was fighting the full weight of the 30-ton aircraft through raw, desperate strength. His first seconds at the controls were a blur of terror and instinct. He pulled, he pushed, he wrestled the yoke, the bomber shuddering and groaning, but it began to stabilize. He was flying, but survival was more than just staying level. The first attack wasn't his. It was the enemy's. The swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s, having just delivered what should have been a killing blow, circled back to watch their prey die. They saw the bomber waver, but not fall. Instead of a death spiral, they saw a ghost in the cockpit, a single figure wrestling with the controls. For the German pilots, it was an unnerving sight. They regrouped to finish the job. Finch saw them lining up for another head-on pass, their cannons winking with death. He had no gunners who could see them coming, no co-pilot to call them out. He only had one insane option: to break the rules of bomber flight completely. His weapon was the bomber itself. In a moment of pure, calculated desperation, Finch shoved the yoke forward, throwing the B-17 into a violent, terrifying dive. Bombers were not supposed to dive. They were stable, lumbering platforms. The airframe screamed in protest, rivets popping. The wind roaring to the shattered cockpit became an unbearable physical force. In the back, his crewmates were thrown against a fuselage, thinking this was the end. But the maneuver was so radical, so unexpected, that it worked. The German fighters, anticipating a slow, straight target, overshot completely. Finch had just used a 65,000-pound bomber as a fighter plane. He had proven the concept. He could make this crippled giant dance to his will. But it only poked the hornet's nest. While most of the German fighters broke off, assuming the diving bomber was doomed, one ace pilot, Oberleutnant Kurt Hegel, was not fooled. He rolled his FW-190 expertly, diving after the fortress, lining up an exposed belly in his sights. Finch felt the shudder of cannon shells striking the tail of his aircraft. He had to pull up, but the strain was immense. The bomber, not designed for these stresses, felt like it would tear itself apart. As he hauled back on the yoke with all his might, another engine sputtered and died, trailing black smoke. The consequence was severe. He had escaped the fighter pack, but at the cost of more critical damage. Hegel, low on fuel and ammunition, finally peeled away, waggling his wings in a gesture of grudging respect for the pilot who refused to die. Finch was now alone, but his plane was even more broken, limping on 2 good engines and still hundreds of miles from home. For Alistair Finch, the battle was far from over. His radical dive had saved him from the initial swarm, but now his situation was arguably worse. The B-17 was flying sluggishly on just 2 engines, losing altitude and bleeding hydraulic fluid. He was a wounded animal, and the hunters were everywhere. The second wave was not an attack he could launch, but the constant, terrifying threat of the next German fighter patrol spotting his slow, crippled bomber against the clouds. He was alone, deep in enemy airspace, and every passing minute was a roll of the dice. His only hope was to use the intermittent cloud cover below, dipping into the white expanse to hide for a few precious moments before re-emerging to check his position against the sun, his only compass. This is where the story shifts. On the ground, at a German fighter control station near Hanover, confusion was setting in. Radar operators of the Luftwaffe had been tracking the American bomber formation since it crossed the border. They had guided their FW-190s to the target, and their pilots had reported multiple kills, including AB-17 from the 384th Bomb Group that was seen taking catastrophic damage to its cockpit before entering a steep terminal dive. The kill was confirmed. The blip on their radar screens, designated Light Seal 7-3, should have vanished. But it didn't. Instead, after a dramatic drop in altitude that took it off their main plot boards, a lone contact reappeared, moving erratically. It was flying far too slow for a healthy B-17. Its heading was west, but it wandered, sometimes veering northwest, sometimes southwest. The controllers were baffled. The pilot, Hauptmann Richter, called his commander. Was it a damaged bomber attempting the impossible? A reconnaissance plane on a strange mission? Or was it a technical glitch? A ghost on the radar? They had no reports of parachutes from that specific aircraft. The initial report from Oberleutnant Hegel, the last pilot to engage, only added to the mystery. He had reported seeing the bomber still under control before he broke off. Richter made a decision. He would not scramble another fighter group. Fuel was precious, and chasing a single, doomed bomber that was clearly no longer a strategic threat was a waste of resources. He would simply have the radar plot tracked until it inevitably disappeared from the screen. This decision, born of German overconfidence and logistical discipline, was a stroke of luck Finch desperately needed. His erratic flight, a consequence of his inexperience in the battle to control his dying plane, had become an unintentional form of camouflage. He was creating chaos and confusion in the enemy's highly ordered system. The result was mixed. The German high command was ignoring him, but the aircraft itself was failing. He had to shut down a third engine as it overheated, and the bomber was now barely maintaining an altitude of 5,000 feet. The strategic victory of confusing the enemy was completely unknown to him. For Finch, the escalation was a personal one, a desperate minute-by-minute battle against gravity, freezing temperatures, and the failing mechanics of his machine. Just as a sliver of hope began to return, Alistair Finch broke through a low cloud bank and saw a scene from a nightmare. Below him, barely 2,000 feet over the frozen Dutch landscape, was another B-17. It was Thor's Hammer, a bomber from his own squadron. The plane was in its death throes, trailing smoke from 3 engines, its landing gear dangling uselessly, a sure sign of total hydraulic failure. Circling it like vultures were 2 German FW-190s, no longer making full attack runs, but lazily peppering it with machine gun fire, waiting for it to either fall apart or for the crew to bail out. Finch could see the tiny figures of men clustered near the open bomb bay doors, preparing to jump into enemy territory and certain capture. This was a distress call, not a voice over radio, but a silent, horrifying spectacle. For a rational man, there was only one choice. Finch was flying a crippled wreck on a single, sputtering engine. He was losing altitude, and the relative safety of the English Channel was still a lifetime away. The logical, sane act was to duck back into clouds and save himself. But in that moment, logic vanished. He wasn't a navigator anymore, or an astronomer. He was the only thing standing between 10 of his fellow airmen and a POW camp. He made the selfless, insane decision. Instead of running, he pushed the yoke forward, dipping his shattered bomber's wing, and turned towards a fight. The final showdown was not a battle of guns, but pure sacrificial audacity. The two German pilots, toying with their prey, were stunned to see the ghost bomber, the one they'd heard about on the radio, the one with its cockpit blown open, descending toward them. It was an act of complete madness. It wasn't even trying to fight. It was simply flying at them, a huge, unmissable target. Confused and intrigued, they abandoned Thor's hammer and turned to engage the suicidal new arrival. Finch gripped his controls, the wind a solid wall against his body, as he flew directly between the fighters and the bomber he was protecting. The world erupted in violence. Cannon shells, meant for the other bomber, slammed into Finch's wings and fuselage. The last functioning engine coughed, sputtered, and finally died with a gut-wrenching screech of tortured metal. His plane, already a wreck, was being systematically dismantled around him. The instrument panel, or what was left of it, disintegrated. But Finch did not waver. He held the yoke steady, becoming a shield of aluminum and steel. For 90 agonizing seconds, he absorbed the full fury of the enemy's attack. It was just long enough. The pilots of Thor's hammer, given this miraculous reprieve, pushed their own dying plane into the cloud bank and vanished. The rescue was complete. The German pilots, their fuel now critical and their primary target gone, gave Finch's silent, gliding bomber one last look of disbelief and broke away for home. Alistair Finch was now alone in the sky, in every sense of the word. At just 1,000 feet, his B-17 was no longer an aircraft. It was a 30-ton glider. He could see the gray line of the English coast on the horizon. The final limp home was a silent, terrifying glide, a desperate struggle to keep the wings level as the ground rushed up to meet him. The bomber finally crash-landed in a farmer's field in Kent, skidding for hundreds of yards, shedding its wings and tail before coming to a final violent stop. The plane was obliterated, but in the twisted metal of the cockpit, Alistair Finch was impossibly alive. To truly understand the miracle of Alistair Finch's survival, we have to pause the story and look at the machines. His survival depended on the unique strengths and ultimately the weaknesses of three key components: the bomber, the navigation tools, and the fighter that hunted him. First, the hero's machine, the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress. It was not a nimble aircraft. The B-17 was a 30-ton behemoth, powered by four Wright R 1820 Cyclone engines that gave a top speed of around 287 miles per hour. Its nickname, Flying Fortress, came from its formidable defensive armament: 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns covering nearly every angle. It was designed with one philosophy in mind: to be tough. Its strong airframe and redundant systems meant it could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and still, in theory, bring its 10-man crew home. However, it was built to be a stable, high-altitude platform, not a fighter. Its controls were heavy, and it responded slowly, making it predictable prey for the more agile German interceptors. The hero's true weapon was not a gun, but a piece of paper and his intellect. His primary tool was a standard-issue RAF Navigator's star chart. This chart, a Mercator projection of the Earth, allows a navigator to plot a course in a straight line. By using a sextant to measure the angle of the sun or stars relative to the horizon, and knowing the exact time from a chronometer, a navigator can pinpoint his location anywhere on Earth. But Finch had no sextant, no clear view from an astrodome, and likely no working clock. His technique was a desperate, bastardized version of celestial navigation known as dead reckoning. He used the sun's position in the sky to get a rough bearing for west. He knew the sun sets in the west, and at midday in the northern hemisphere, it would be in the southern part of the sky. By keeping the sun at a certain angle relative to his shattered cockpit, he could maintain a generally westward course. So, why was his unorthodox tactic so effective? Finch's violent dive worked for one reason. It was something a bomber pilot would never do. German fighter tactics were a refined, practiced science built around predictable flight patterns of heavy bombers. A sudden, 5,000-foot dive broke every rule and expectation. The FW-190s, attacking at speeds over 400 miles per hour, simply could not recalculate their attack vector in time and overshot. Later, when he used the B-17 as a shield, he was exploiting its sheer size. By placing his massive 104-foot wingspan between the attackers and their target, he created a physical barrier they could not ignore forcing them to engage him instead. He turned the B-17's greatest liability, its size and lack of agility, into his most effective weapon. Alistair Finch's incredible flight, while a singular act of heroism, sent ripples through the command structures of both the Allied and German air forces. On the Allied side, his survival was more than just a miracle. It was data. His harrowing debrief, detailing the head-on attacks and the escort's early departure, provided a visceral, first-hand account that reinforced what the grim casualty numbers were already screaming. The unescorted bomber doctrine was a catastrophic failure. The disastrous raid on Oschersleben on January 11, 1944, where Finch's group lost dozens of aircraft, became a turning point. It was a bloody exclamation point on the argument that generals like Ira Eaker had been losing. The high command could no longer ignore the evidence. The direct consequence was a dramatic and urgent shift in strategy. The development and deployment of long-range escort fighters, specifically the P-51 Mustang with its revolutionary Merlin engine and massive fuel capacity, became the highest priority. Doctrine was forcibly changed. Within months, bombers would no longer fly deep into Germany alone. The sight of P-51s accompanying their heavy friends, all the way to Berlin and back, would break the back of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force. Finch's survival became a testament to the desperate need for this change. While he didn't invent the P-51, his story became a powerful symbol of the vulnerability the Mustang was built to solve. His one-man stand helped accelerate the end of the era of the self-defending bomber. On the German side, the effect was more subtle but just as significant. The report from a confused fighter control station and the debrief from Oberleutnant Hegel painted a picture of an enemy with an almost fanatical will to survive. While the German High Command had been winning the air war in early 1944, stories like Finch's created a psychological ripple. The Americans were not just taking losses. They were adapting in impossible, unpredictable ways. This forced German fighter wings to adopt even more aggressive tactics and expend more resources to ensure a kill, sometimes ordering pilots to confirm a crash visually, burning precious fuel and time. In a small way, Finch's defiance contributed to the slow bleeding of the Luftwaffe. His action, multiplied by the bravery of thousands of other airmen, didn't just win a single battle. It helped change the very rules of the air war over Europe, contributing to the eventual Allied air supremacy that was essential for the invasion of Normandy just 5 months later. When rescue crews arrived at the crash site in Kent, they expected to find only bodies. Instead, they found Alistair Finch conscious but suffering from severe frostbite, exhaustion, and a broken arm. His debrief was met with disbelief, but the crew of Thor's Hammer, who had landed safely at a coastal emergency airfield, confirmed his story. The quiet Navigator, who had single-handedly flown a crippled bomber home using the sun as a compass and saved 10 men by using his own plane, as a shield, became a quiet legend in the 8th Air Force. For his extraordinary courage and skill against impossible odds, King George VI personally awarded Alistair Finch the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of Britain's highest honors for valor in the air. After recovering, he was deemed too valuable as an instructor and spent the rest of the war training new navigators, imparting the crucial lesson of what to do when everything goes wrong. After the war, he returned to Cambridge, completed his doctorate, and became a respected professor of astrophysics, spending the rest of his days mapping the quiet, predictable cosmos. He passed away peacefully in 2002, surrounded by family. The machines, however, were not so fortunate. Finch's B-17, the Stardust Lancer, was a complete write-off. Its back broken, its engines wrecked, and its fuselage riddled with over 200 cannon and machine gun strikes. It was unceremoniously salvaged for parts and scrapped on site. It exists now only in grainy after-action photos and the memories of the men who saw it perform its final, defiant act. Thor's Hammer, the bomber Finch saved, also never flew a combat mission again. The damage it sustained was too severe, and it too was relegated to the scrap heap. But his entire 10-man crew survived the war, a living legacy of Finch's sacrifice. The enemy also met their fate. Oberleutnant Kurt Hegel, the ace who had dueled with Finch and shown a moment of respect, survived the war. He flew over 150 combat missions, but was shot down by a P-51 Mustang in late 1944. He spent the last 6 months of the war in a British POW camp. After his release, he became a quiet civilian and worked as a production manager in a German factory until his retirement. His fighter wing, WWII, which had so dominated the skies in early 1944, was decimated by the arrival of the long-range P-51 escorts later that year. Their reign was over, and they were ultimately swept from the sky by the very strategy that Alistair Finch's desperate flight had helped to vindicate. The story of Alistair Finch is a powerful testament to the human spirit. It's a story about how, in the face of overwhelming odds and catastrophic failure, one person's courage, ingenuity, and a little bit of luck can triumph. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a complex machine, but the unbreakable will of a single individual who refuses to give up. He was a scholar forced to be a warrior, who used the quiet knowledge of the stars to navigate the chaos of war and bring his men home. If this story of incredible bravery moved you, and you believe that heroes like Alistair Finch deserve to be remembered, do us a small favor and hit that like button. It tells YouTube that this story matters. And to make sure you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten heroes of history, hit subscribe and be sure to turn on all notifications. We have so many more incredible stories to share with you. We want to build a community of history lovers here. So drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us make sure the legacy of Lieutenant Alistair Finch doesn't disappear into silence.